be with you as we are starting this brand new series, Influences. Over these next 2 months, we are going to be exploring some incredibly powerful words that Jesus said in probably the best known block of teaching from Jesus in our Bibles. We have 4 Gospels or biographies of Jesus: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the New Testament. And in Matthew's Gospel, the first Gospel, there is a block of teaching from Jesus that is probably the best known out of any of his teachings. We call it the Sermon on the Mount. It's found in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And we're going to be zeroing in not on the whole Sermon on the Mount at this point. We're going to leave most of the sermon for some other series to come. But for these next 8 weeks, we are jumping into the introduction to the sermon. A passage or a series of statements that Jesus makes that we call the Beatitudes. And over these next 8 weeks, we want to unpack these Beatitudes, these statements that Jesus makes at the very beginning of this influential message that he delivered one day. And we're calling it Influences, and the reason for that will be explained next week when JD's here. He's going to explain why we've called it this and what the impact of that is. Today, though, I want to try and give us a little bit of a bird's eye view of all of these Beatitude statements before, in the coming weeks, we start to really dive deep into some of them and unpack what they really mean. So to do that, I want to ask and answer 4 key questions today. But to begin with, I want to ask you a question, and it's this: what does it mean for you to live your best life? What does it mean to live your best life? It's a statement I'm hearing increasingly in the last few years. People who will talk about or maybe post on social media, living my best life. Well, what does that mean? What does it actually look like? Because that really is what people all over the globe are looking for, isn't it? People may describe, I want to be happy, or I want to be fulfilled, or I want to have good fortune. It can be described in various ways, but ultimately people are looking for some sense of meaning and purpose and success in life. A few months back, Rochelle and I were on our way home from Africa. We were in Kenya and Uganda training some church leaders, and we ended up in Hong Kong for 2 days. It was a really special time just to hang out there and see a part of the world we'd never been in before. And one of the days we just played tourists, and we got on a cable car in Hong Kong and went out to Nang Pong village. And as we were there, we walked across this bridge, and there were these things called blessing drums along each side of the bridge. And I stopped and took a photo. Here's the photo of the 4 drums on one side, and there was another 4 on the other. And what I want you to notice is the words on these drums: success, fortune, health, luck, and there were 4 other words on the other side. But these ones grabbed me because there's a sense in which, doesn't matter where you go in the world, here's what people want. People want to live their best life. They want to live a life of success. They want to have a life of good health. They want to have a life of good fortune. But the question we need to stop and think about is, what does that actually look like? What is your best life? How do you decide what makes your life good or very good? What are the characteristics? What are we looking for if we want to live a really good life? And in a sense, that's what Jesus is talking about as he begins this most famous block of teaching we know as the Sermon on the Mount. That's what Jesus is going after in these statements that we call the Beatitudes. What does it look like to live our very best life? So to understand these and give us a bird's eye view of these today, I want to ask and answer 4 questions. The first question is, who? Who is Jesus talking to when he makes these statements? Because how we answer that question has a big impact on how we understand what's going on and how we answer the coming questions. So who is it that Jesus is speaking to? Well, in Matthew chapter 5, this is the way that Matthew begins the story in verse 1. He says, "Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down." And that's because as a rabbi, a Jewish rabbi, when they were going to officially teach, they would sit rather than stand like I'm doing. So he went onto a mountainside and he sat down. The crowds were there. Verse 2, his disciples came to him and he began to teach them. So I want you to notice there's 2 groups of people listening to the Sermon on the Mount. There's the big group, the crowds, which is just the multitude of ordinary people who are flocking to hear Jesus at this point because of his teaching, his miracles, his healings. So there's this big group of the crowd, but then there's a smaller group within that called his disciples. Now, this is not just the 12. This is a larger group of men and women who have begun to follow Jesus as their rabbi and their leader and their Messiah and King. So we have a large group, the crowd, and we have a small group, the disciples. Now I want you to notice again, we might put the words, there's verse 2. His disciples came to him and he began to teach them. So who's the them that he's teaching? Well, in grammar, you simply, if there's a pronoun them, you come back to find who's the them, what's the nearest word to that? It's disciples. So this becomes really, really important. These words that Jesus is about to say, these beatitudes, are being said primarily to his disciples. The Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is inviting the crowd to listen. And at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, at the end of Matthew chapter 7, the crowd is going to be absolutely amazed at Jesus' teaching. But what we need to see is that Matthew's telling us quite carefully, as Jesus begins to make these statements, his primary audience is the men and women who have chosen to follow him already. So who is Jesus speaking to? He's speaking to his disciples. He's speaking to his followers and saying what's about to come specifically to them. So if that's the who, the second question is what? What is it that Jesus says to them? What is Jesus going to say about and to his followers? And that's what we come to as we continue in verse 3. Jesus said, Matthew 5 verse 3, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed, 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 blessed." What I want us to see is the overall picture today before we dive deep into these Beatitudes in the coming weeks. And what I don't want us to miss is the most blindingly obvious thing in the whole set of Beatitudes, and it's the common word that links them all. It's this word, blessed. In fact, that's what beatitude means. Beatitude comes from the Latin word for blessed. So these are the blessings, in other words. These are a series now of statements Jesus making to and about his disciples, his followers, and they're statements about what it means to be blessed. So if we're going to understand what Jesus is saying, we have to understand this word. What does it mean to be blessed? One of our problems is that in English, we have this word in our different translations of the Bible, and it may be in other languages too, this word blessed. But in the Greek language that the New Testament was written in, there was actually two different words for blessed. And we translate both of them blessed. So we miss some of the nuance. And then when you go back into the Old Testament, you take another step back in time into the Old Testament, which was written in Hebrew, they also had two different words for blessed. So it's helpful to understand these different words that are used. So the first Greek word here is eulogio, which is the equivalent as a Hebrew word in the Old Testament, barak. And eulogio and barak really mean a prayer or a petition or a request that's made to God. That God, would you please bless these people? And so sometimes this might be some young parents holding a newborn baby and praying a blessing over that baby. Or it might be a father on his deathbed gathering his children and pronouncing a blessing on them. Very famously in the Old Testament book of Numbers, Yahweh, the God of Israel, he calls on Aaron, the high priest, and the high priests who would follow him through the centuries to pray a prayer called the blessing over his people. In fact, some very, very skilled musicians turned that into a beautiful song a few years ago. Remember the blessing? The Lord bless you and keep you, make his face shine upon you. That's directly taken from Numbers chapter 6. In fact, it was during the lockdown. I hate to bring lockdown up because it depresses us. But do you remember in lockdown and the blessing just went around the world and different versions were made by Christians in different countries? And I think the best one out of all of them was Aotearoa, New Zealand. Ours was cool, wasn't it? It was just outstanding. So that's the blessing, and it's based on this prayer that the high priest would pray over God's people. Yahweh, may you be blessed. May you bless these people and draw them near and turn your face towards them and so on. So in Numbers, the word is Yasir. And when it gets translated into Greek, the Greek word they use is eulogio, and we translate that blessing. So this is really important. That's not the word that Matthew's using. That's not what Jesus says. See, these words, eulogio and barak, is a prayer or petition of what God might do. It's expressing a hope of what God might do. He might bring his favor on people in the future. But there's another set of words. There's another word in the Greek language, makarios, which translates a word in the Hebrew Old Testament called yasir, and this is the word Jesus uses. And this is not a prayer that God might bless his people. This is a statement that they're already blessed. So this is not a hope for the future. This is a description of now. Jesus isn't here in the Beatitudes. He's not praying a prayer or making a request. God, would you bless these people? He's looking at his followers as he's sitting on the mountaintop delivering the Sermon on the Mount, and he starts off by saying, if you're my follower, you're blessed. You're blessed. God's favor is on you. God's approval is on you because you're already following me. It's a statement of fact, not a prayer for the future. So if you take a beatitude, let's just take the third one, for example, verse 5, Jesus says, blessed are the meek, or the gentle, the humble. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Jesus is not saying, if you are meek and if you work hard to be more meek and humble, then you will inherit. Jesus is looking at his followers and saying, you're blessed. Because you've humbled yourself to enter my kingdom, you are the meek. And so the blessing, the approval, the favor of God is on you. It's a statement of reality about who they are because they've humbled themselves to come into his kingdom. See, Jesus is speaking here, not to the crowd's listening in, but he is speaking to his followers. So who's Jesus speaking to? His disciples, his followers. What is he saying? He is describing the reality of God's favor on them. He's describing God's favor on his followers. He's saying, how fortunate you are. So that leads us to the third question then. So how does he describe them? Because he makes a series of statements, doesn't he? Blessed are, blessed are, blessed are. He's describing his followers. Man, you're fortunate, he says. And he describes them with these series of descriptions. So what are these Beatitudes saying? Well, this is where I want to read them and for us to listen to these words. But the problem is, if you are a follower of Jesus and you're kind of new to this faith and you don't know the Bible very well and you've never really looked at this passage before, you may well read these words and go, wow, this is not what I expected. But for many of us sitting here or watching online today, we come to these words and they're kind of familiar to us. We've seen these before, we've read these before, we've heard these before, we've studied these before. You know, and it's like familiarity breeds contempt is the saying. And it's not like we come to this with contempt, but we do come with a familiar eye and a familiar ear. We're used to hearing this. So I want us to hear these beatitude statements of Jesus today in a fresh way. So on your chairs today, when you came in, is this bookmark that Harrison was holding before. There's different colors of them, but all of them are exactly the same. And it's just a bookmark for the series to capture that. But on the back is a paraphrase of the Beatitudes that I've written. Now, a paraphrase is not a proper translation done by a scholar with a PhD. It was done by me. And a paraphrase is not so much trying to be an accurate translation. It's more trying to express what's being said in a fresh way. And so I've done this so that we might hear what Jesus is saying in a fresh way. So I want to read these words. Now, if you are like me, if you're over 50, and you're struggling to read this, we're also going to put them up on the screen just to make it really super helpful. Yeah, I can hear the relief. Actually, there's more. Some of you that aren't 50, I don't think, are all relieved as well. But here's what I want to read these words, and I want to invite you to actually read them out loud with me if you would like to do that. I want us to see the words, and I want us to hear these words in a fresh way. So let's read them together. How utterly fortunate are those who declare spiritual bankruptcy. Why? Because they are the ones who will inherit the jackpot of God's kingdom. How utterly fortunate are those who weep over their sin. Why? Because they are the ones who will have their tears dried by God Himself. How utterly fortunate are those who are gentle with others. Why? Because it is only the humble who get to enter God's kingdom. How utterly fortunate are those who earnestly crave after holiness. Why? Because that deep hunger will one day be completely satisfied. How utterly fortunate are those who show compassion and kindness to others. Why? Because they are the needy recipients of grace. How utterly fortunate are those who desire to be pure in the core of their being. Why? Because they are the ones who will one day actually look on the face of God. How utterly fortunate are those who seek to bring shalom, wholeness, into every space in this world. Why? Because they will be honored as those who exemplify the God of peace. How utterly fortunate are those who are persecuted, insulted, and slandered simply because they are my followers. Why? Because they are the ones who enter the eternal kingdom with great acclaim, just like the prophets of old. So when you stop and you hear these words in a fresh way, you begin to realize how utterly different these words are. What Jesus is teaching is so different than the way our society and our world and we generally would approach life. Jesus is taking this idea of the best life, a blessed life, an utterly fortunate life, and He's explaining it in a way that turns everything upside down. Now, by the way, Jesus is not here describing 8 or 9 different groups of people. So Jesus is not going, well, blessed are you who weep over there, because you had to sit way far away from me. And so, blessed are you who weep. And, oh, look at you lot, you look pure. Blessed are the pure in heart, this group right here, And over here, blessed are the peacemakers, you wonderful people. It's not like Jesus is talking about 8 different groups of people and saying, you're all blessed. No, He's talking to who? His followers. Those who have trusted in Him, committed their lives to Him. He's describing 8 different descriptions of the one group. He's talking about His followers. And He's describing these attributes of people who are utterly blessed, utterly fortunate before God, approved. So how does Jesus describe His followers? He's describing in these words, He's describing the countercultural traits of God-dependent people. He is describing countercultural characteristics that mark people who choose to come to Him because they're utterly dependent on God. He's describing a completely different kind of life. See, this is what we need to hear today, folks. As we try and get this bird's eye view of all of these statements before we start diving into individual ones. Here's what Jesus wants us to hear. In God's world, it is the utterly fortunate before God are those who are utterly dependent on God. The utterly fortunate before God are the utterly dependent on God. In other words, what Jesus is saying is that the people who are really, truly living their best life are the people who have given up on themselves and are trusting just in God. who have realized that actually if we want to be really successful in life, success is not measured by what's best for us, what makes us feel great, what meets all our needs. A successful life in God's view, a life that has God's approval, that God says, that's what I'm looking for. The utterly fortunate before God are the people who've realized they've come to an end of themselves and they step away from themselves and they go, no, I want to live for God. An utterly fortunate life, the best life according to Jesus, is a person who doesn't live for their own needs, but for what God wants. Who doesn't live for their own desires, but for what God desires. Who doesn't live for their own pleasure and their own glory, but what pleases God and brings him glory. The utterly fortunate according to Jesus are those who are utterly dependent on God and live for him. And folks, I don't think we realize how radically different this is to the world we live in. See, the world we live in, it's all about you. And to live your best life is to simply live a life that's utterly wrapped up and self-absorbed, isn't it? So for fun, I've rewritten the Beatitudes. And I've rewritten them the way I think that people in our world, just as they would have in Jesus' world, this is how most people would describe what a great life looks like. Have a look. How good it is to be self-reliant. How good it is to have a good time. How good it is to confidently assert yourself. How good it is to be true to yourself and your own desires, whatever that is. How good it is to demand your own rights. How good it is to not live by a bunch of someone else's rules. How good it is to give as good as you get. And how good it is to just cruise through life and not offend anyone. The truth of the matter is, for most people who don't know God, that's the description of the best life. I want to have a life where I don't have to rely on anyone else. I just, look after number one. And I want to live a life where I'm not going to try and offend anyone, but if someone gives it to me, I'm going to give as good as I get. I'm going to live a life where I stand up for myself. I'm not going to hurt anyone else if I can help it, but good night, it's all about me. That's the way that the vast majority of people, that's the way our society works. That's the way society in Jesus' day worked. And Jesus is coming along and he is flipping that upside down. That's what we just sung a few minutes ago, isn't it? That last song after communion. Did you hear those words that you sung? Your kingdom is backwards. It flows in reverse. That's exactly what Jesus is doing in these statements about what a blessed, approved, fortunate, favored life looks like. So our world says it's really good to be self-reliant. And Jesus comes along and says, nah. The utterly fortunate are the ones who realize their spiritual bankruptcy and come running to God. Our world says, how good is it to not live by a bunch of someone else's rules? And Jesus comes along and says, no, actually, it's really good to crave the holiness of God from the very core of your being. The world says how good it is to be true to yourself and your own desires. And Jesus comes along and says, no, how fortunate you are if you're craving the righteousness of God. See, Jesus is taking the ideal of what our world would say and he is flipping it upside down because his kingdom is backwards. And what he wants his followers, those who have already chose to trust in him, and the listening crowd who may want to trust in him, he wants them to realize this. Look, my view of life is completely different to the way the world generally works. You want to come after me? You want to pursue me? You want to follow me? You want me to be your Lord and Master and King and Savior? Then understand that means stepping away from yourself and realizing the best life is not being self-absorbed and living for yourself. Instead, it's becoming an utter dependency to God and living now for him alone. In God's world, the utterly fortunate are the utterly dependent. The utterly fortunate are the utterly dependent. A blessed life according to Jesus. A life that is being lived well according to Jesus. A life that has the seal of God, his approval on it, is a life that is lived in dependency on God and for the glory of God. I mean, folks, these statements are radical. Jesus is calling to us today and saying, you know what? You are doing great if you are willing to acknowledge how broken you really are. You are living a fantastic life if you are persecuted and insulted for me. Life is truly good. It's absolutely brilliant if you're choosing compassion and kindness when people don't deserve it. He's taking everything we think is the norm and he's turning it upside down. And by the way, as we're going to see next week, he's not just saying, therefore you're blessed and God's approval is on you. He's then going to say next week when JD's here, and by the way, when you're like that, you have an incredible influence in this world, far beyond you realize. So in God's world, the utterly fortunate, the truly blessed, the ones who really are living the best life, are those who are utterly dependent on him. So we've asked and answered 3 questions. Who is Jesus speaking to? He's speaking to his followers, his disciples. What is he saying about them? That they are already blessed by God and approved and favored by God. And how does he describe them? Well, he's describing all of these traits that are really about being utterly dependent and living for him. So the final question as we finish up then is why? Why does Jesus say, if you're broken, if you're meek, if you're striving for peace, if you're persecuted for him, why does Jesus say there's the best life? That's really good. Why does Jesus say that? Well, that's what every beatitude's actually going to tell us. See, Jesus is going to come along and say various statements like, because they are the ones who will inherit the jackpot of his kingdom. They are the ones who will have their tears dried by God himself. They are the ones who will one day actually look on the face of God. See, what Jesus is saying, the why, is Jesus is saying these are the people who are truly blessed and fortunate and living their best life because they are relating to God now and forever. They are right with God right now and will be with him for eternity. So as we finish today, as we kind of try and set the scene and get the overview of these radical statements before we start diving into them one by one, I want us to get the sense that Jesus is coming and saying something so radically different, it really probably hasn't dawned on most of us to the full degree that it needs to. So I want to come back and I want to ask us that question I asked us at the beginning. What does it mean to live your best life? What does your best life really look like? Because if your best life is wrapped up in your fulfillment, in your hopes and dreams, in your financial security, and having a good time and the next big thing you've got, if your best life is all about you, you've missed what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying the truly fortunate, those who are blessed and approved by me, the ones who really know my favor, are the ones who have come to the end of themselves and instead thrown themselves onto God. In God's eyes, those who are utterly fortunate are those who are utterly dependent. So Jesus, we come to you at the beginning of this series so grateful for these words that you spoke on this mountaintop. Thank you that you are turning our world upside down. Thank you that you're trying to help us see that your kingdom is radically different. It's backwards. It flows in reverse. And so we come to you at the beginning of this series and we simply ask, Lord Jesus, that you would change our mindsets, that you would help us see the world differently and our careers differently and our families differently and our lives differently. And we pray that you would break us where you need to break us and mold us where you need to mold us so that we would become more and more dependent on God and more centered on God. Lord Jesus, help us to live these words out for your glory.